Hello all, and welcome to this three-part introduction to spiritual ecology, a practice of ancestral embodiment. I have some slides to pull up and share with you here. And the first slide being a quote by Stephen Jenkinson from his book, Die Wise. Being at home in a given place means having an enduring recognition and knowledge of that place, and finding your clan identity in that endurance. This, though I came upon it very recently, is a quote that really brings full circle a lot of my own practice, research, and seeking in the many, many years I've been on my path, and frames out really beautifully the course that I will be teaching this coming year, Spiritual Ecology. Let me go a little bit more deeply into what that means, though. And I want to start with the work of Emily Conrad. She put really succinctly that there is, in industrialized nations and in the West in particular, this insistence on homeostasis. And it's a homeostasis of sameness, of what is physically and emotionally acceptable. But what happens is it eventually leads to a loss of adaptability and responsiveness. Homeostasis in a capitalist society is the steady momentum of growth and progress. That's homeostasis, growth and progress, right? And what I'd like to propose is this can really be likened to attempting to breathe by only inhaling. It's not only unsustainable, it's impossible. And yet this false narrative of maintaining a constant state of ascent, increase, and expansion, essentially a perpetual season of spring, has become a cultural agreement in the West as to what is valued, what is celebrated, what is sought after. Youth, novelty, striving, peak experiences, transcendence. Now, our understanding of what spirituality is has not escaped this conditioning, which is really about being in control. And that's the colonial mindset of power over, of individualism, the meanness of my experience, of what I want to get, what I want to manifest, what I want to attract, what I want to achieve, without consideration of who then goes without, who is taken from, who is oppressed in order for your aspiration to be met. The seen and unseen levels of interbeing are not accounted for in a society based within a methodology of separateness. Now, when we inevitably fall out of this idealized colonial homeostasis of extraction, many mistake their underlying disconnection from what it really means to be human, to be changeable, multidimensional, impermanent. They mistake this underlying disconnection as depression. And so try to fill this perceived void with more inhaling, with another flatline, with happiness. When, as psychotherapist Frances Weller explains, what they are actually starving for is aliveness, is engagement with what he says is the wild and exuberant depth and weight and diversity of a full spectrum life, a life that also includes the descent, decrease, and contraction of the exhale and the natural pause of both fruition and rest. Aliveness then is recognition with our innate cyclicity, and it's a reconnection of this innate cyclicity, a biofrequency we share with the rhythms of the earth, Emily Conrad also says that the fluid within our tissues is our primary healer. Nothing outside of ourselves. I'll say that again. The fluid within our tissues is our primary healer, physically, mentally, emotionally, spiritually. When that fluid is vital, meaning it has the ability to move, it maintains its primary resonance with its source, the planet and the galaxy. These are all Emily Conrad's incredible ways of wording this very poetically. Because all manifest movement begins with the movement of breath, as Conrad says, poor breathing habits force fluid to remain immobile and result in loss of resonance, which is also to say our capacity for healing. We literally have a spiritual ecology with place, the spiritus, the breath, being the embodiment of its cycles of aliveness. Now, the ancients knew that their survival depended on maintaining somatic sentience with this animacy, on tracking its shapes and sounds and scents, its tastes and textures and temperatures over time and season of plant, mineral, animal, and elemental life, both seen and unseen. They also understood that in being a part of place, their presence had a dynamic influence, that every interaction had a consequence within our shared interbeing, making not only our interconnection sacred, but our embodiment as well. Just as we respond to our surroundings respond to us. And my teacher, Colin Campbell, explains this as, it's not magic, it's relationship. David Abram, incredible eco-philosopher, summarizes this as such. We can sense the world around us only because we are entirely a part of this world. Because by virtue of our own carnal density and dynamism, we are wholly embedded in the depths of the earthly sensuous. We are born of these very waters, this very air, this loamy soil, this sunlight, nourished and sustained by the substance of the breathing earth. We are flesh of its flesh. We are neither pure spirits nor pure minds, but are sensitive and sentient bodies able to be seen, heard, tasted, and touched by the beings around us. I would also say dreams, synchronicities, intuition, insight, and the imagination are all a part of this, of what Tokapa Turner calls nature naturing through us. So this goes for the unseen as well, for all time and space, past, present, and yet to be, which is why, as the wonderful Zen master Thich Nhat Hanh describes it, when you look deeply into your body, you see that your body is a stream. And in that stream, you can see ancestors, not only human ancestors, but animal, plant, and mineral ancestors. There's a continuum. That is a continuum of the known and unknowable, local and non-local, temporal and eternal, life and death. As such, all actions were once in service to this totality and entraining with its coherence of emergence, growth, decay, and latency, of the inhale, pause, exhale, pause. Spirituality first began at this intersection of survival, the somatic, and the sacred, wherein it was not a practice. It was a process, a living thing itself, not stuck onto a part of the day, but the day itself. Many have identified the resulting absence of aliveness in their lives as a disconnection from this ancestral belonging to place, and so have returned to lineage traditions in an attempt to reclaim practices to restore them to that wisdom. Now, while I believe it is absolutely imperative to learn about the art, music, dance, story, prayer, ritual, language, and life ways surrounding the cosmology, mythology, migration, and food of our ancestors, practicing certain traditions out of context is problematic because of the colonial mindset, systemic to modernity, and the messaging we have been conditioned within. To take without the right to, regardless of the consequences, in order to fulfill a desire or need that often requires and perpetuates systems of privilege. Systems that lack the consciousness and conscience to consider just because you can doesn't mean you should. Just because you can doesn't mean you should. As kinesiologist Chanan Bonser explains, this is particularly pertinent to those within the industrial complex whose pre-existing levels of detachment and dysfunction make further fragmentation a real risk, especially during the practice of traditions from intact cultures, where the communal, contextual, and psychic reference points that allow for full integration are in place. So, questions to ask, as Colin Campbell proposes. What kind of ritual is appropriate for use in different locations, with different groups, and for different purposes? To what extent must we follow a particular system or tradition of ritual? And how much can we include our own direct knowing of what is required? What permissions do we need and from where? And finally, how much training is needed? Human beings have a developmental necessity for connection and meaning that Western society cannot provide, which is why we are reaching for the traditions of intact cultures that still remain and those that have survived from our own lineages. But without a full understanding of their power and intent and an embodiment with the ecology from which they first arose, these traditions can feel disingenuous at best and detrimental at worst, particularly if they are not oriented towards becoming a part of place in service to community, human and more than human community. An incredible quote to sort of lead us into or on into a more authentic way of approaching this is through the wonderful mystic Basho, who said, "Seek not the paths of the ancients. Seek that which the ancients sought." Our ancestors sought deep ecology with environment, an embodiment with place through spirit, through breath, through rhythm, through cyclicity. It's kind of the same word for all of those things. Our ancestors' paths, their art, their music, dance, story, prayer, ritual, language, cosmologies, mythologies, migration, food, and life ways, they all arose from, and so therefore point us back to, this embodied aliveness. This is what Martin Prt1 means when he argues that it's not excavating old lost cultures from the past we should be focusing on, but establishing the indigenous integrity from which those cultures first emerged. That indigenous integrity is spiritual ecology. And it is what I believe the gifts we are born into this life with hold us responsible to. In the knowledge that, as Suquamish and Duwamish leader Chief Seattle is attributed to stating, we do not inherit the earth from our ancestors. We borrow it from our children. This is why I believe Prt1 reassures us that when you can't remember what to do, what to say, or what the deeper teachings are, when all else escapes you, just remember, always feed what needs feeding, always make beauty. And he goes on to say later, it's making beauty in a way that nourishes a time beyond our own. Now, knowing what needs feeding comes through embodiment and recognizing its endurance with place. And this takes us back to Stephen Jenkinson's quote. Because of the disembodiment we often come with, which is layers of inherited and untended sociocultural, economic, political, environmental, physical, and psychological impacts, both historical and personal, we must first address recalibrating our biofrequencies. This is because the body always overrides the mind. No matter how much you may try to convince it otherwise, the body cannot be manipulated into believing something it is not certain is true. The number one condition the body needs to have in place in order to let down its stress signals, and therefore the hormones that govern its responses, is the necessity of safety. If the body does not feel safe, it cannot land and locate, which is a phrase by the wonderful Liz Cook, embodiment practitioner. It cannot orient to time and space, in other words. We cannot co-regulate our fluid body with the rhythms of the earth that support our health and healing. So we need to invite the body to process what has gone unmetabolized and unintegrated. And we do this through these 5 different aspects. I'm going to speak to these in a little bit more detail than is on your slide there. The first is restoring the vagal or vagus nerve, the vagal system, the vagus nerve. The vagus nerve is one of the major pathways of the nervous system that orchestrates our stress response when it perceives a threat, which, if unable to down regulate, continues to signal danger to the body. We will be doing a vagus nerve practice with the eyes. The eyes are deeply integrated into the vagal system. The eyes are where we hold 80% of our body's tension. 80% of your body's tension are held in the muscles of the eyes. Now, for Westerners, people in industrialized society, a lot of our movement is hyper-focused forward. Our primitive nervous system hasn't evolved all that much in the years since we became human. In primitive times, our primitive brain registers hyper-focused forward movements when we're staring at the same kind of mid-range place for many, many, many hours, perceives that as tracking a threat, tracking a predator, or a predator tracking us. We don't have lateral movement for the eyes. The body feels like it is in a stress response state. We need to address that through the vagal system. This helps us to activate cerebrospinal fluid, and that's its own thing, but it is interconnected with the sphenoid bone, which the muscles of the eyes are attached to. Sphenoid bone is attached, integrated into the base of the skull. Base of the skull is, of course, part of our spine. Now, the cerebrospinal fluid flows between the base of the skull and the pelvic sacrum. Now, if there is a lack of mobility in the spine, the paired movement of the occiput and the sacrum that occurs when we breathe cannot create the pump this fluid needs in order to flow along the spinal cord. And this compromises the circulation of neuropeptides and electrolytes that are vital to cellular and thus overall health that cerebrospinal fluid carries. And it also compromises our proper nerve function and communication. We'll be doing a practice of spinal rolls that really brings us from like that natural startle position into the natural fetal position that the spine can take on. The next piece is to release the psoas muscle. In traditional Chinese medicine, the psoas is called the messenger of the soul. Messenger of the soul, because it cannot lie. The psoas muscle is the first to contract and the very last to release during a stress response, and may therefore be constantly contracted in a state of hypervigilance in those who are in a constant state of dysregulation. Our stress response system, as I was saying a little earlier, it developed in large part during the time of our hunter-gatherer ancestors, who primarily encountered acute, very short-term stress, not the chronic, long-term stress of the modern world. We're going to be using a very gentle movement to release the psoas muscle. It is attached to the mid-back T12, and it is attached to all of the lumbar vertebrae all the way down in through the pelvic, the pelvis, and it attaches on both sides to the backside of the femur bone. So a very deep core muscle and messenger of the soul. It cannot lie, no matter how many affirmations, how much positive thinking you do, you cannot trick this muscle from releasing if it still believes it's not safe, if it's still in a stress response. Next is opening the fascia, and that is that three-dimensional communication system of fluid connective tissue that permeates all of our organs, all of our muscles, our bones, and the nerves. And it helps to direct movement, function, energy flow. And it also holds on to memory. It has a sixth sense, right? It has it will hold on to certain states. And we need to release and open that fascia. Lots of circling and massage to open those pathways is a gentle and restorative way to do that. And of course, we want to support the nervous system so that it can better regulate and therefore access its parasympathetic mode, in which our bodies slow their processes down in order to digest. Digestion, of course, is where we get all of our nutrient extraction from. To detoxify, this is when our housekeeping system comes through and sweeps out all of the toxicity and debris from the cells that are turning over and over and over again. And to regenerate, that deep sleep, deep rest state. We need to do all of this in. And we'll be doing a universal breathing practice, common everywhere we go. And it is known to mimic the vibration of energy, the vibration of creation. That's a humming breath. The breath, as Conrad emphasizes, is key in summoning our life force, as it determines our intrinsic mobility and adaptability, qualities that are fundamental to being human and therefore regenerating ourselves back into ancestral embodiment. And as such, the breath is essential to these practices of assimilation so that we can come back into relationship with the place and the rhythms that animate life. So this is the end of part 1 in this 3-part series on spiritual ecology, and I'll see you in part 2.